Well, welcome everyone. It's great to see some friends here and some visitors. We're happy to have you. My name is Reagan Waskom, and I serve as the director of the Colorado Water Institute, and it's my pleasure to get us kicked off this morning. They're going to bring in some water here in a few minutes, and then at the break we'll have some coffee and refreshments come in as well, and then afterwards we'll have some refreshments. So if you're thirsty, just hold on. They're coming. So again, I want to welcome our visitors from off campus. It's really great to have you all here for this discussion today. This is Steve Mumme's brainchild, I would say, to have this symposium to talk about the U.S.-Mexico salinity crisis of 61 to 73 and to put that into a historical context and I think into a present day and maybe even a future-looking context as well. I think that'll be interesting for us. I think Stephen's done a great job of pulling this together, and we appreciate that. Stephen has been a resident fellow with SoGES. And for those of you who don't know, SoGES is our School of Global Environmental Sustainability. It's not a college, it's a school that cuts across colleges and is an interdisciplinary center that's really focused on sustainability issues. And Stephen's been a fellow there, and as part of that fellowship, he's put together this symposium. I think we'll have an outcome of it, Stephen, some sort of a recording, and perhaps papers will come out of this as well, we're hoping. And so we appreciate SoGES's help in pulling this together. The reason I'm here is the Water Center is also pleased to help sponsor this. We think it's an important topic. And so CSU Water Center was glad to work with Stephen on this program. And I should also note the Department of History, Political Science, and the Latin American Studies program also helped to support the travel of our speakers and the like. So we're grateful to having that support. So I'm looking forward to a good discussion, and I want everybody to, pitch in and be part of it, students as well as faculty. Let's all get in, ask questions, and enjoy looking into this topic. I've had good experience working on saline soils and saline water and salinity in my career as an agronomist and as a water resources person, but this treaty is something I'm hoping to learn more about today. So it's not something that I have deep knowledge in, but I think what we want to do is take this look back, and not just from a historical and academic perspective, but I think we need to think about salinity control as an issue that's still important, right? For managing the river, for managing the watershed, for the operation of the Colorado River system. And as I look forward, I think as any of us look forward, and we look at the growth projections, the water demand projections, we look at climate changed hydrology, we look at extreme events, and hey, let's don't forget the structural deficit in the lower basin and the unresolved tribal claims. It just gets more difficult, right? It doesn't get easier looking forward. And this is true from both a water quantity and a water quality perspective. And a lot of times these two topics get split apart, and you've got different camps talking about quality and quantity. And I think it's important to bring these topics together and think about this pretty holistically as we face some of these problems. And looking back is important. We need to know how this was set up so that we can go forward and we can find our path through both the institutional and regulatory, but as well as the biophysical challenges that are out there. So again, today's discussion I think is academically interesting, but I just want to go on record again as saying I think it's relevant to managing this system, and I want us to think about this. And as I thought about this topic, again, as an agronomist, it all goes back to salinity. Why do we care about salinity, right? It's more than just because we have a treaty. Salinity has real impacts out there. We know that it affects crop yields, but I think even more importantly than that, it impacts long-term land productivity. As you irrigate with saline waters, you're diminishing the productivity of that land, and it's very hard to reclaim those lands once that productivity has been lost. Reclaiming salinity is difficult, hard to reverse. It's not impossible, but it limits not just what we can do in the future, it limits what you can grow right now, right? So you've got crop limitations there. It also damages both hydraulic structures as well as irrigation equipment. It's tough on the equipment. I would say it harms sensitive biota. I think that's a consideration. And then, of course, it increases water treatment costs as well. And when the Bureau of Reclamation kind of ramps all this up and tries to see what is the cost of salinity in this system, their number is north of $300 million a year that are lost values as a result of that salinity that's in the system. So this is a practical problem that we need to solve. And then on a personal note, when I was named the Colorado water quality specialist, extension water quality specialist in 1991, which doesn't seem like that long ago to me, but my point is that at that time we had 9 full-time salinity specialists in western Colorado between NRCS and CSU, and these were master's and PhD level engineers and agronomists that were working on this topic with funds from USDA and from the Department of Interior to try to solve the human-induced load, right? So we know that about half the load is probably natural and the other half is due to man's activities. And so we had tremendous expertise all through the 90s and actually back in the 80s working on this topic in Colorado. They're all gone now. Those funds are gone, those people are gone, that expertise is gone. The problem remains. And I think that, again, underscores the reason that these discussions are important, that we continue to work on them. And so I miss those colleagues. CSU had great salinity expertise at one time, and it's an important international problem. But I think to kind of bring my welcome to a close, I want to thank Stephen again for conceiving of this idea and sort of being the intellectual thought leader behind it. But I really appreciate who he's brought together here today to have this conversation. So welcome to you all. Let's have a great conversation. Thanks students and others for being here. We are taping this for posterity, so we'll be using mics to speak. And I don't know if we need to use the mics for questions and answers. Is that the... Okay, so we'll have to use the handheld mics so that the Q&A gets recorded as well. If you guys will be patient with that, I'll try to do that. So, Stephen, without further ado, thank you. The program is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to have Adrian Howkins introduce Adrian, a well-known historian of the Arctic and ecological issues, I think, in a variety of different geographic locations around the world. And Adrian's going to be sort of introducing the participants and speakers as we go. So, Adrian. So,
thank you very much. So, welcome again. I don't know very much about the question of salinity, so I'm looking forward to learning from all of the panelists. But I think I can claim this past January to have been to Don Juan Pond in Antarctica, which I think is the most saline place anywhere on the planet. So that's my entry point to this. So I'm going to introduce the speakers as they go. So starting with Steve Mumme, professor of political science, specializing in transboundary environmental diplomacy here at Colorado State University, a leading authority on the International Boundary and Water Commission in the United States and Mexico, as well as other transboundary environmental agencies in North America. I went onto the website to see if I could get a sample of publications, and there were far too many to mention. So an extremely well published and an expert on this theme.
thank you, Adrian. I'm going to switch places here. Is this mic? Okay. Can you hear? Okay, that's good. All right. So this is I think a kind of nerdy topic. It's what animated me to do this is simply work that I've done since I was a graduate student. Mucking around in various archives, national archives, archives across the Southwest, looking at U.S.-Mexican water relations. So that's typically what I want to look for. And one of the issues that crops up to an extraordinary extent in any sampling of archival documents from the 1960s to the present is the salinity dispute. So I had the opportunity to finally delve into it more fully a couple of years ago and began really working the archives on this particular topic. And then about last summer, I was asked to write a paper focusing on the issue of equity. And so those two themes kind of came together, and I thought the salinity dispute was one of those subjects that really draws out the importance of equity as a value and as a negotiating tool in international diplomacy involving really any natural resource or any problem, but particularly in the area of transboundary water. And so I wrote this paper, Constructing Equity During the U.S.-Mexican Salinity Crisis, 1961-1973. And I just want to go through it very, very quickly. I'm going to try and hold my comments to under 20 minutes. I have about 15 slides. I'm just going to kind of march through this. Let's see. Where's that? So, number two. Okay. The salinity crisis is an event that is triggered in 1961, in October of 1961. It involved the discharge of saline water from a U.S. irrigation district on the lower Colorado River above the northern international boundary and Mexico's international water intake at Morelos Dam. It had the immediate effect of raising the salinity by almost 4 times, in the treaty water that Mexico receives. And so Mexico immediately protested, and so the dispute was on in 1961. Now, it's important for a variety of reasons. Let's see if I can get there. It's what is where's that? Trying to go back. Yeah. Okay, can you get back? Let's see. Okay, so I just wanted to go through this really quick. It is the most important bilateral water dispute that the U.S. and Mexico had or has had since the 1944 Water Treaty was signed, ratified in 1945, it in many ways leads to the consolidation of the 1944 Water Treaty. Now, one thing that a lot of people don't know about this, because I think that we've it's kind of receded into the depths of memory among stakeholders in the Colorado River, they don't realize that at no time in the history of the 1944 Water Treaty has it ever been contemplated to quit the treaty. But it was during this time. And it was brought up on several occasions by both U.S. diplomats and folks, stakeholders on the river, members of the Committee of 14, and it was brought up by Mexico. So that really raised the stakes. And when this treaty was, this dispute was settled in 1973, in Minute 242 of the International Boundary Water Commission, that agreement is the most important consolidating agreement that we have for the 1944 Water Treaty. That's why it's important. It's not like all the other dozens and hundreds of minutes on the U.S. and Mexico have signed under the International Boundary Water Commission arrangements, but it really did have an enormously consequential effect on the U.S.-Mexican water regime. So that's important. It also, from a sort of broader perspective of international law and principle, it has the effect, not literally, but more than figuratively, of creating the establishing an international commitment to something called equitable utilization on on the river. So, and that's a commitment that goes beyond the Colorado River. It's a commitment that extends to all of our undertakings on transboundary rivers that are shared between or that intersect between Mexico and the United States. So it has a broader significance for how we manage water today and how we think about water today along the U.S.-Mexican border. It did establish the principles Reagan has mentioned of basin-wide salinity control in the Colorado River. And it's not as if the salinity crisis itself was the first recognition of the problem of salinity in the Colorado River Basin. That had been widely recognized, but one of the things that this agreement does is to accelerate dealing with the problem of salinity on the Colorado River. I think but no question that what Minute 242 moves that agenda ahead much faster than it would have normally occurred if the various stakeholders had just continued talking among themselves into the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and so forth. That would have been that would have gone more slowly. It introduces environmental considerations into the discussion of and the agreements on bilateral water management for the first time. It identifies the need for groundwater management along the U.S.-Mexican border. And I always like to point out that it really is sort of the beginning of an environmental discussion on the Colorado River and on the border rivers for the first time. We see books being published. We see scholarly analyses being undertaken, and that's important. Theoretically, it's interesting too, from a pure political science point of view. It contradicts that is Minute 242, the agreement, contradicts the standard assumption that greater power and upstream position would really determine the outcome in transboundary river disputes. It's sort of counterindicative of what we would normally expect. It contradicts the idea that equity really doesn't matter in realist constructions of how nations relate to one another to solve problems, especially on international rivers. And it supports the idea that international customary law and the principles associated with international customary law and practice can be influential in determining the outcomes on international rivers disputes. And that's something that international lawyers still contest. So we talked about the origins. In this paper, one of the things that I do is I talk about equity, and I was really driven by an article that Doug Kenny and a colleague wrote in 2012, looking at the Colorado River Compact and looking at equity as it plays out in the context of the Colorado River Compact. The topic of equity has been widely discussed by a number of scholars over the years. Generally, there's an agreement that there's something called substantive equity in the management of international rivers. It involves reciprocity, involves the idea of fidelity. You keep your agreements. It involves the idea of reliability, that people should be able to depend on agreements or contracts made. And the idea of flexibility, that in matters of water and water management, it's a fluid resource, it's a mobile resource, it's a variable resource, that you have to be flexible in managing this kind of a resource. In fact, I think the principle of flexibility is probably amplified in the area of water more than any other natural resource issue in which nations may come into conflict about. And then there are procedural issues too involving equity. We talk about inclusivity, diligence, transparency, issues like that. So the salinity dispute very quickly plays out. It's a complicated development. It involves multiples of three administrations in both countries, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. It involves Adolfo López Mateos, Gustavo Díaz Ordaz. It involves then Luis Echeverria in Mexico. It's protracted, and that's in part what makes it interesting diplomatically, because this is an issue that, as I mentioned, is sort of unique in the sense of it, the priority that it held for the two governments. Mexico, throughout this period, considered this the #1 bilateral issue with the United States. From 1961 to 1973, it was #1. At no time has water ever reached that level, apart from maybe the water treaty itself and the negotiations that lead to the 1940 water treaty, and culminating in 1944 and ratified in 1945. This was a very high priority for Mexico. The U.S. recognized that, and at various moments it becomes, I think one can argue, the most important issue for the United States with Mexico, simply because Mexico pushed the issue so hard. And so other issues, immigration, trade, other issues that the U.S. really wanted to engage were kind of shoved off the table, at least momentarily, as the two governments tried to reach agreement on this. The legal positions were defined very, very early. This dispute really resolves, as I say, in 5 acts. It's three stages, 5 acts, et cetera. And right from the beginning, the legal positions are defined. The U.S. Legal position is really defined by this idea of fidelity. That is, the treaty says, okay, that Mexico will get water from any and all sources, whatever their origin. It seemed to be categorical in the treaty. And the U.S. basically says, well, we're sorry that Mexico's getting bad water, but that, in fact, is what we agreed to in 1944. And it's necessary. We have these water operations on the lower Colorado River that require that we remove saline water, that we return irrigated water to the river, that are just inherently, by their nature, going to add saline values to the river. And so that was the U.S. position. We can't but do this. We have to manage, we have a right to manage our own water. It's going to produce salinity. We're just doing what water users do, and we're faithful stewards of our water. And unfortunately, it has this value at Morelos Dam. Okay, so that was the U.S. position, built heavily around the idea of being faithful to the reading of the treaty, sort of I guess what you call a juridical literalism on the treaty. The Mexican position from the very beginning was based on the idea of reciprocity. Mexico focused on the idea that, yes, saline values would rise on the river, true, but at the point that we receive our water, it should be equivalent to the water that people were using immediately across the boundary. So what was happening in the Mexicali Valley should be equivalent to what was happening in the Imperial Valley or in the Yuma Valley. That was the argument. It wasn't that salinity wouldn't rise and that salinity wasn't a problem. It was this idea of reciprocity. We should be treated equally at this point. So that's where things evolve, and you see that in 1961 and in the discussion 1961, 1963, and then things evolve in these various stages noted, and I'll come back to some of that. Probably, and I'll just mention this, probably the stage that's best noted about this agreement is probably the Brownell stage, at the end of the, when Nixon commissions an independent commission to go to the region and hammer out an agreement with the stakeholders on the river. And that was former Attorney General of the United States, Herbert Brownell. But there's a lot in between. We talked about the U.S. legal position, Mexican legal position. I want to just add to that, the U.S. position is not just that it doesn't have an obligation to Mexico in the area of water quality, but it's also that the treaty trumps customary international law. It's an interesting thing. Curiously enough, Mexico accepts that interpretation. That is, Mexico initially agrees to that. That's the starting point in these negotiations. That the treaty, and this is standard international law too, that the treaty should in fact take precedence over broader, more general principles in international law. But one of the things that I want to mention and kind of pull out of this, or to sort of two supporting ideas, one in the United States, one in Mexico, that really come out of this diplomatic correspondence. One is on the U.S. side, it's that there is a kind of technical way of addressing the reciprocity issue, and this was framed in the international law idea of reasonableness, and the technical way to get to reasonableness, which was the way you get to reciprocity, was through this concept of salt balance. Salt balance is the idea that any irrigation operation would simply return to the river the amount of salt that it received. And so if you did that, presumptively, you wouldn't get too much salt down at the lower end of the river. There would get some, because you can't control everything. But you would get some at the end of the river. And so the U.S. latched on early to the idea of salt balance. Interestingly enough, there were people like Carl Hayden in Arizona that thought that was a bad idea, because he just thought that the U.S. didn't have any obligation to Mexico, pure and simple. And he thought that even adopting a technical rule was a tacit admission that there was some obligation downstream, and that was interesting, et cetera. So the U.S. plays around with this idea of running out of time. Okay. It basically tries to focus on this idea of salt balance as a technical fix, for Mexico, the interesting thing that is sort of driving the Mexican position on the salinity dispute is legal. It's legal. It's that the U.S. has an obligation in international law, and that's in the treaty. So it could go to the treaty and could say the U.S. has agreed to resolve disputes by international arbitration in Article 24 of the treaty. Running behind. So I want to go through. In the early stages, basically, the U.S. is focused on fidelity. Mexico is focused on reciprocity. The one interesting part of this early stage is the whole issue of how, avoiding the issue of salt balance, how you might temporarily deal with the Mexico demand. And very quickly it was brought up both by the IBWC and certain engineers, hydrologists at Bureau of Reclamation, that it might be possible to bypass the Mexican saline water and send it to Mexico, charge it to Mexico, so there was no change in the Mexican, the U.S. allotment, the Mexican allotment, et cetera. But at least it would avoid contaminating the water at Morelos Dam. So there was that. And so that obviously did not play well with certain hardline views. Carl Hayden famously says, well, if you do that, you pretty much accepted the Mexican argument. But others disagreed. And interestingly enough, the senators here in Colorado and the people in Colorado in the upper part of the Colorado River Basin thought that that was a practical and reasonable, sensible thing to do. In stage two is not too much different. You start getting into this issue of technical fixes that raises the issue of flexibility. The U.S. argued that things should be that Mexico, the United States should work flexibly to find ways of managing the salinity. One of the backstories here is the continued insistence that part of the problem was Mexican agriculture, and Mexico wasn't managing its agriculture effectively so that it could handle larger quantities of salinity. And so that's one of the interesting issues. Mexico continues to sort of emphasize reciprocity, but at the end of this period, we get Minute 218. And Minute 218 is the temporary agreement, 5-year agreement in 1965. It's actually negotiated at an earlier period, in late 1964. And Minute 218 accepts the idea of the bypass. The bypass is central to Minute 218, and the U.S. Accepts the idea that it will try, within reason, to manage the level of salinity at Morelos Dam using technical means. Now, in this, I'm going to get to the second stage here. Then after this is in 1965. After 1965, you're into the regime set by Minute 218, and that's a fairly peaceful time, etc. Neither country has conceded its legal positions. They're still discussing salinity, but mainly within the terms of Minute 218, because that's what they had agreed to. And so at this point, then you begin to see other issues intruding. The principal one is over groundwater and the use of groundwater at the border to satisfy part of the Mexican treaty obligation, and that becomes a very complicating issue during this period. But things really crop up as Minute 218 terminates or reaches its conclusion, 1970, forcing salinity back onto the agenda. And at that point, then there are negotiations. There are famous negotiations in October and November 1971. This is the point where the U.S. comes closest to getting Mexico to agree to its version of a salinity solution. And it comes very, very close. The Mexicans have virtually agreed to a document. And then all of a sudden, they quit and walk away. They just turn around and walk away. And the fascinating part of that is that there's a bit of personality involved. That Mexicans thought that they had been they had not been faithfully spoken to by different people in the State Department, and that there was an effort to game the system, and they just walk away. So, at any rate, so from that point forward, then you have an impasse, and it plays out in the context of high-level negotiations between Mexico and the United States, between the foreign ministers, and interestingly enough, focuses on a summit in 1972 that the two presidents, Nixon and Echeverria, are going to have. The Echeverria administration taken office in the late 1970 and decided to really push the Mexican position hard. What happens is there's an interesting meeting between Henry Kissinger and the Mexican foreign minister, and it's really kind of a poignant meeting, and the Mexican foreign minister just lays it on the line. This is an issue of fairness. It's an issue of international law, and a technical fix will not do. Curiously enough, Kissinger decides apparently that he had it with the Salinity dispute, and he doesn't contradict Emilio Rabasa, the Mexican foreign minister, and he takes that argument to Nixon, and he says, we've got to have a solution here. Maybe we can pitch it right at the summit, but this is where the Mexicans are, and they've taken their stand, and we've got to do something. That then is when Echeverria meets Nixon. It's an absolutely fascinating transcript, and I think Echeverria had been prepped to deal with Nixon. He knew how to appeal to his ego. Henry Kissinger had already laid out what the Mexican terms were and how the U.S. should handle it. He was already prepared to convene the Brownell, what would become the Brownell Commission, and Nixon buys it. He does, and at that point, then you get this top-heavy presidential effort to convene the Brownell Commission, and the Brownell Commission, of course, then meets from September of 1972 through December of 1972, lays a proposal on the table, and that becomes Minute 242 with a few modifications. So I think I'm going to go back here. So Minute 242 does several. I just want to finish here. It basically is a win-win water management agreement, I think, for both sides. It famously sets an equivalency standard at Morelos Dam. What else? It's interesting because it accepts this idea of equitable utilization, but it doesn't say so. It's not written in. Technically, to this day, both sides have their legal positions on the river, but in fact they don't. And I think that's well known. And it really does show the compelling force of equity here, because one of the interesting things is that you basically see the reciprocity issue prevailing. And the U.S. kind of undermines itself in different ways in terms of how it's managing the river, and particularly with the groundwater thing going on the lower Colorado River, et cetera. And it becomes clear that the United States is not going to prevail in an international adjudication. The State Department understood that. The State Department understood it. It was hard for the basin states to accept that reality. And I think, a lot of credit goes to the Interior Department, both under Johnson and Stuart Udall, and is it? I'm trying to remember the Secretary of State under Nixon. There were two. Wally Hickel first, and then who was it? Rogers. Rogers after. And they get a lot of credit because they had to manage the basin states, etc. So that's an overly long discussion, but this is a complex negotiation that goes on for 12 years. It really does demonstrate how a steadfast focus on equity in the context of international law and the new dynamics of international law kind of won the day. And if nothing else, made things so inconvenient for the United States that certain presidents were exasperated and decided to commit themselves to a solution and a lot of money. So there you are. Evan, I'm sorry it took so much time.
Okay, our next speaker is Evan Ward from the Brigham Young University Department of History. His talk is going to be How Salinity Saved the Delta. Professor Ward is associate professor specializing in U.S.-Mexico border history, the author of Desert Oasis, Water and the Political Ecology of the Colorado River Delta, 1940 to 1975. And I'll give you a 2-minute warning after when you've done 18 minutes to keep us on track.
Go ahead and if you can look and
Yep,
see
good.
if that's there, I'll go ahead and start speaking. Well, I'm very grateful to Steve, to SoGES, and all of you for the opportunity to be here today to talk about the salinity crisis. I also feel at home and want to dedicate my comments to my father, who's an agronomist. And Alfonso's an agronomist. Paul's an agronomist. And so I grew up, if you're a grad student wondering what you should study, sometimes those things closest to home are those that matter the most. I'd like to direct my remarks to the same topic that Steve has outlined in his excellent presentation, looking at it from the other side of the border, and how Mexico constructed the ideal of political equity. I think we should not overstate how big an issue this was in Mexico. In fact, there are some parallels to the U.S. war with Mexico in the 1840s, a conflict that was looked at maybe with less importance and urgency in the historical perspective for the United States, but was very central to Mexican identity in the 19th century, as this event would be in the 20th. And so as I was leafing through photos of the protests that went on in 1961 and 62, and there's actually, if you have your program, open your program there and look at the cartoon political cartoons at the bottom there, and one says, La sal no debe separar a dos pueblos amigos. Salt should not separate two friendly nations or two friendly peoples. And this was what Mexican protesters were directing towards the American consulate in Mexico, in Mexicali, and wanted the American press to be able to see. But as I thought about my presentation for today, I thought there's really two discussions going on. What the Mexican protesters wanted the Americans to see, and then also the discussion that they're having amongst themselves about this question of political equity. Indeed, President Echeverria said in my talks with the President of the United States and other functionaries, my advisors and I perceived there that this drama, or better said, tragedy, did not resonate with Americans the way it does with those of you here in Mexicali Valley. And so I want to look at just a few snippets that if you were living in Mexico at the time, would have resonated with you. These are less technical, but if I had a chance to go back and rewrite my book, I think I would have been a little more philosophical. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. So we'll start with this first slide. And when I wrote Border Oasis, I was very intrigued that Mexico in 1950, when they built Morelos Dam, whose purpose was to take water from the Colorado River into Mexicali Valley without depending on the Imperial Irrigation District, they capped this dam with a monument to Jose Maria Morelos. And sometimes we don't think a lot about monuments, but they really matter. They matter to historians now. And as I thought about coming here and talking today, I thought maybe it would be worthwhile for us to think about this as well. And what does Jose Maria Morelos have to do with this? So this is 11 years before the salinity crisis breaks out. That's when farmers from the Welton Mohawk Valley, these are veterans, okay? All of these people, it's a tremendously human story. Veterans that have been farming in Arizona since the 1940s are having severe problems with drainage. And they eventually elect as a district to pump the highly saline water into the Colorado River, regardless of thinking about the impact downstream. Well, there was an equally invested group in Mexico. These were campesinos, many who had come back from the United States in 1935 when President Lázaro Cárdenas sounded the call for Mexicans to populate and cultivate the land in Mexicali Valley. So it's an intensely human situation that draws on Mexican history as well as the United States. And Mexicans would have looked in their dialogue about political equality back to their own independence movement. This will all come together nicely. I have a reading assignment for you today. I'd encourage you to get a book called Mexico, Biography of Power by Enrique Krauss. He's the preeminent, he's the David McCullough of Mexican history. And he has this wonderful book that has 40-page vignettes about each of the Mexican presidents. And he said that the ideal of social equality within Mexico took on as much importance for Morelos as that of national independence from Spain. So this goes back over 100 years. And on this monument to Morelos, there are two epigrams. One that says, "The earth is the nation. Let us cultivate it so it is free." And that's from Morelos. Below that was a quote from the president at the time, Miguel Alemán, that said, "Irrigation will enrich the work of our farmers." And so Morelos' statue was placed astride the border prior to the salinity crisis and accentuated his insistence on equity and fairness as much as it celebrated Mexico's independence. Let's go to the next slide, and there we have that quote. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. The next sort of vantage point that Mexican farmers, diplomats, and politicians are looking at in their political history in constructing an argument of political equity is the Mexican Revolution that takes place from 1910 to 1920. From my own reading of the Mexican Constitution that comes out of that period in 1917, I actually believe that there is something of a contract made between the government and the tillers of the earth, that they are going to protect, nurture, and maintain the land and the natural resources needed to stimulate agribusiness, but also subsistence production. You have these small tracts of land called ejidos that are inalienable. They can't be sold off until the 20th century. And you also have large-scale agribusiness going on at the time. But I would argue that the Mexican government had a responsibility to protect the land and natural resources, which included water. If you go back in the environmental history in Mexico, water is as important as land. In fact, it might be more important because without the water, you can't cultivate these pieces of land in Morelos, like Emiliano Zapata. And so the Mexican Constitution is going to enshrine the priority of the government to conserve land and water and to ensure a more equitable distribution of public wealth. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. The next place that we want to come to see an argument about equity created is during the salinity crisis itself. There's a lot going on in Mexico in the 1960s, as you might be well aware. President Echeverria, who is the Minister of the Interior, has a little different twist than we think of the Interior Secretary in the United States, because the Minister of the Interior in Mexico is in charge of internal security. He's not worried as much about trees as he is about order. And guess what happens under his watch in 1968 at a place called Tlatelolco, a plaza on an evening in the fall. There's a massacre. Several hundred students are mowed down in the process. And Luis Echeverria is next in line, really, to be president of Mexico. And so he's going to come to the presidency in 1970 at a very low point in Mexican politics. He's actually dealing domestically from a position of weakness, not from strength. This is when the walls of the PRI begin to show cracks. And Echeverria is going to do all that he can during his presidency from 70 to 76 to rally the support of those most likely to give him their vocal support. This would include the campesinos in Mexicali Valley. And so let's go on to the next slide. One philosopher, writer in Mexico that would have resonated with Mexicans at the time was Octavio Paz. And he wrote something that a lot of Mexicans might have been thinking at the time about the United States. The essential attribute of the macho, power, almost always reveals itself as a capacity for wounding, humiliating, annihilating. So Alfonso's contemporaries, the generation before they came of age, are thinking about this not just in terms of the relationship with the United States, but now also with their own government. So Luis Echeverria has a large obligation to fill to try and shore up confidence in Mexico's ruling establishment in the early 1970s. Let's go to the next slide and then go to the end. So Echeverria is going to mount the most spirited diplomatic campaign he can in dealing with the United States to resolve the question of the salinity crisis, particularly on a footing of equality, because that matters more than anything in 1972 domestically than it did in terms of foreign relations with the United States at the time. Let's return to where I started, to Morelos Dam. In 1974, the Foreign Secretary Emilio Rabasa stands at the dam and makes the argument that I've just made. From the birth of our independence through the wars and foreign interventions that we suffered in the past, during the Revolution of 1910, that was calculated to put an end to the Porfirian dictatorship, and above all, upon approval of the Constitution of 1917, all power of whatever nature should be framed and function within a just, legal system. So as much as foreign policy, there were domestic considerations driving Mexico's negotiations. Really interesting that they actually had a public event where Minute 242 was celebrated. I don't know that this happened in the United States then or since. And this event right here might be the first memorialization of the salinity crisis. But looking at this with two sets of eyes is the most important way to look at relationships between the United States and Mexico. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Alfonso Cortes Lara from the Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Tijuana and its Mexicali Research Campus. He is the author of Transboundary Water Conflicts in the Lower Colorado River Basin, Mexicali and Salinity in the All-American Canal Lining Crisis, which came out in 2015.
Good afternoon, everyone. I first want to thank Mumme for the invitation to stay here. It's a pleasure to me stay here near the Rocky Mountains, just where the water starts, to talk about a little bit of the water at the end of the Colorado River. So, let me put it in this place. Let's change. Okay. The issue that I bring here to share with you all, very good framed by my predecessors in the presentations, is about the perceptions of the people that was really and directly affected by the salinity problem, by the salinity crisis in Mexicali. And this is some part of the results of the study that I performed, I did during the recent years, in the Mexicali Valley Farmer, and this includes the San Luis Rio Colorado Valley also. And I had the opportunity, and I was so lucky in this, because I had the opportunity to talk with people that was living the problem in the 60s. And I still could speak with them while they were live. Many of them has already passed away, unfortunately. But I got many learnings, many experiences directly from these people to know exactly how they live the problem, how they see the salinity and directly in their parcels with white spots over there and the water in the winter of 1961 and the day before they wake up and saw the water in their parcels with a little layer of salts in the parcels. So I could recover some of this kind of experiences directly from these people. But let me frame this with Charla, this talk, by mentioning that the U.S.-Mexico relationships has a history of interdependence in terms of commerce, in terms of people going to the U.S., going from the U.S. to Mexico, and obviously water. And this brings about the let me see this. How can you see this here? Okay. Here? Brings about the rapid economic and population growth in some areas of the border region, like this at the end of the Colorado River, which includes Tijuana, the San Diego, Imperial, Yuma, San Luis, and Mexicali valleys. So this is a very an important conglomerate that make an intensive water use, and this also brings about the or induce an ever-transforming process for shading waters. Since the water treaty that already mentioned Steve, and the following 320 minutes that have been written to make more stronger the water treaty. And the salinity problem is present since the 1960s, and I say until today, even today, nowadays. The salinity problem was in the 60s. In the 70s was found the solution, permanent solution, definitive solution. But in the 90s, we have sediments problems in the Colorado River, plus the salinity. In the 80s, 90s, and 2000, we have, even before, the All-American Lightning conflict, plus the salinity. And in recent times, this decade, the prolonged drought and the salinity and the earthquakes in Mexicali. And all this is related with the salinity in the Mexicali Valley, with the salinity concentration in water, underground, surface water, etc. So the salinity is part of our life. And I don't want to go through this. It's not over. It's not. It's here, but not there. And sorry. Okay, it's here. Okay. Well, we are part of this problem, and we are at the end of the river. We have in this region, particularly in the Mexicali area, in San Luis, 1.2 million people and more than 200,000 hectares, and just 60 miles of the water course. And in this very point is accumulated a huge amount of salts in all the parts in the water and the groundwaters also. This is the Mexicali Valley area, and this is the salts in the Mexicali Valley. We have this data just for a little reference. In 1916, we used to have 800 parts per million. In 61, we got 2,700 parts per million. And the following year, half this almost. And currently it's about 90-20, the average that we receive in Mexicali, which is 120 plus 50, 121 plus 50 parts per million, with taking in consideration the concentration in Imperial Dam. And this big picture, I wanted to take this picture, big picture to show you the results of this work, to analyze the perception of the water users in Mexicali. This is how they perceive the salinity increases in 1960s, and how the salinity affected the different areas of the valley, because it's not the same. The Mexicali Valley has different areas. It's north, central, south, and San Luis Rio Colorado. And the characteristic of institutions that they use or they implement in the Mexicali Valley, and how these institutional arrangements impact the irrigation district conditions, and how these farmers impact the solutions at the local level and even at the binational level. see here. Okay. I use this methodology, institutional analysis approach, and irrigation systems. And I'm going through this. The main idea, the underlying assumption is that irrigators are born into an institutional context that shapes their performance, and in turn, this irrigation's performance shapes the institutional context. And this is what I tried to test in this study, and this is what really occurred. It's a qualitative approach in this study by reaching people in the several regions of the valley, and also water managers working at that time also, and to build a framework for analysis. I'm not going to really at this point, but these are the main ideas that came out from this study. And I can underline these points because they are the most important of the study. What they see as themselves is the strong unification of the people. The salinity problem brings about unity among the people in the Mexicali Valley. The people in the Mexicali Valley and the San Luis Valley that even before were separated from the San Luis, separated from the Mexicali city. But this problem brings together to all these people. The other aspect of this problem, the salinity problem, was the creation of informal institutions. There were already unions in place in Mexicali, but the Union of Unions is a particular form of organization that wasn't exist. Actually, it's informal, but they also came together. The CCI, the business unions, come together. There were 4 or 5. But when the salinity crisis come place, they have to work together to face the problem. And one of the points, particular points, is the acknowledgement of local and presidential leadership. Echeverria or Rabasa, but moreover, the alignment, the vertical alignment between local people and the president of the United States of Mexico. So this was a very, very important aspect for the president to find endorsement from local people. President Echeverria used to go to the Mexicali Valley, even in summer times, which is so hot, and stay with the ejidatarios to make several meetings in their land, to talk with directly, to bring ideas, technical ideas, even technical ideas as in terms of how to face rapidly the problem of salinity. Many of the solutions for the salinity, they were taken directly at the following day of the problem. The diplomacy was working parallel, but the problem was solved since the beginning by the farmers in their lands, by modifying the water use, by implementing best management practices in their lands and production, etc. And this was one of the most important. The other one, the participation of the agriculturists for pushing, for make some pressure to the president, was to establish the rehabilitation program, which is one of the most important programs for recovering lands in Mexico and even in Latin America for the extension and for the resources that they use. But this was acknowledged as a program that was incomplete and full of corruption in the Mexican side, which is critical aspect that they have to face at the same time that they want to resolve the salinity crisis. So two tasks to do. Here. Among the major findings here, as a summary, is that the farmers at that time, during the crisis, 61, 73, was the farmer demonstrated economic, political, and organizational power, as well as leadership to participate and influence, to find effective responses to the salinity crisis. I mentioned economic power because they didn't receive any money from the presidency, from the federal government. They used to collect fees for units, for user. They had the commitment to collect 5 cents per liter that they use, just to use it in mobilizations and social participation mobilizations. So they put money to face the problem from their pocket, really from their pocket. So they had a more important role than that we know. They put money, they put technical skills, they put obviously political pressure on the president and the senators, the deputies, etc., to participate actively in the problem and to find and reach a rapid solution to the salinity that was affecting daily in the parcels. Okay. On another major findings in this study is that the salinity didn't affect in the same way the Mexicali Valley. The Mexicali Valley has different features, different soils, characteristics. There are more silty soils at the north and hard soils in the center and southern of the valley. So the problem is harder in the central area and in the southern area of the valley. And agriculturists need to have to reduce the agricultural individual parcels during that period, and they also reduce the production. And at the same time, they have to increase the water use, okay, because they need water to leaching salts. So they had a really hard time during those times, and they continue to inhibit these problems in agricultural areas. Just to look at the valley, these are the 3 main areas of the valley. The north side is the best part of the valley, and the San Luis has another kind of problem that receives, even talking about the equity, you guys talk about the agreement for the NIB, but the SIB problem is another one. This is water of about 1,200 parts per million, which is hardest problem in San Luis. And this is another problem of salinity in the Mexicali, in the San Luis Rio Colorado at the east side of the valley. And here I pointed since 1973, the SIB point of delivery, Sanchez Mejorada Canal in San Luis Rio Colorado, Sonora, receives salty waters of about this concentration, affecting water management and crop productivity portion in this portion of the district. Since 1973, the Colorado River Salinity Monitoring System at the Morelos Dam considers an annual average. The problem that we saw in the agriculture saw in this area is that the annual average allows peaks in the graphs like this. And this is a very hard problem since 1961. Salts continue flowing to Mexicali Valley. Salts continue accumulating in the soils of the Mexicali Valley. And these salts are accumulated in some periods of the year, mostly during the fall season, as you can see at this moment. The blue line is at the burial, yeah. No, it's in Mexicali Valley, and the red one is in Morelos Dam. The yellow line is the critical 242 line. As you can see, we crossed the line along the year. But the average is very good at the end. And this is a very hard problem because the crops don't understand this kind of behavior. And in addition, since 2001, it is difficult to comply with the salinity differential, which is for the North International boundary between Imperial and Morelos Dam. And curiously, this is in line. This fact is in line with the prolonged drought in the Gulf Basin, and we can see a graph like this, where during the last 15 to 16 years, the U.S. is having some problems to comply with this point. Always comply, but at the critical line, very near the critical line. So this is another problem that we need to go through in these times because it's critical. SILA and IWC are working together to find some solutions for this particular aspect, and for the other one, this of the monthly variations. And for example, they are trying to find different pathways to send water to Mexicali. This red circle at the north is the Imperial Dam, and the Morelos Dam at the south. And there are three paths to delivery of water to Mexico. And the U.S. has to combine these routes or these paths in order to comply with the Salinity 242. But they also are trying to, and this is the northeast over there. It's northeast. And the news are that the U.S. IPWC is trying to get some selection of some deep wells to get water from these wells and conduit it to the north to mix and comply with the salinity problem. So already doing some tasks there, but it's still a hard time today. So what I wanted to share with you is all this stuff. The people is still feeling the problems in their parcels, in the volumes that they receive in both points of delivery, moreover in the southern international boundary. And we need to work together to find a more equitable solution for the farmers, because they feel that it, in fact, was a very good agreement. It was much better than don't have it in 1973, but the problem is still continue affecting the productivity and the quality of the waters that we receive in Mexico. That's it. Thank you.
And finally, we have our discussant, Brad Udell from the Colorado Water Institute. He is the Senior Water and Climate Scientist / Scholar for the Colorado Water Institute at Colorado State University. He joins us from University of Colorado Boulder, so he's going up in the world.
I'm actually, Colorado State University is my home right now, so yeah. Well, what a lovely gathering, and I like the idea that this is the first celebration on the U.S. side of the border of what actually is a really important event, and it is 50 plus years ago, and I would argue that the specifics of this have been lost greatly, but not the impacts of it. And it lives on in the form of Jennifer Gimbel and Jennifer Pitt and their work in recent years, and I think you'll hear more about this. You know, I ultimately think the environmental outcomes of this minute and these 13 years are quite pronounced and quite good. Let me say my family actually had something to do with this, and Stephen, you hinted at this. My secretary of Udall was my uncle, and then my father was later a congressman, and he was a brand new one in 1961, so thankfully his his fingerprints are not over some of what I would call the ugliness that went on early. And to my mind, to look at the U.S. position from this juncture, from a position of equity, it was not tenable. Yet, through our eyes now in 2017 is not the eyes of the people in 1961, right? I mean, Rachel Carson's book was just out, and I was a youngster at the time, and there was a concept of an away then, right? That you could throw something away, and away existed independent of the rest of the mass of the planet, and that was a safe place for things like salt or trash or anything you didn't want. And humans at the time didn't really understand that, you know, we live in a world of mass balance, as the scientist in me would want to say. You know, it's amazing that this went on for 13 years on some level through 3 U.S. presidents. I sort of like to think had President Kennedy lived, maybe we would have solved it. He made a trip to Mexico City during this time and established a lovely relationship with the Mexican people, and they mourned his loss. And one always has to wonder about if he had lived, what else might have happened. On the other hand, you know, from 1961 to 1974, we all grew up environmentally. And I think everyone in this room realizes that, you know, in that period, we got the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and National Environmental Policy Act. And our entire thinking changed during that period. And maybe by 1964, we weren't just ready to deal, or 63 when we lost President Kennedy, we weren't ready to deal with that. You know, it's interesting to me, Stephen, to hear you say that this is sort of, I don't know what your term was, the defining minute of the 321. I mean, I never really thought about it in that way, but there's some real truth to that, isn't there? I mean, I don't mean to dismiss all the minutes, but a lot of them are pretty mundane things, right? And if you ever gone on the IBWC site, a lot of them are pretty darn mundane and not very interesting. Alfonso, I have not read your book, and I look forward to reading it. Your last slide there of meeting the goal, meeting that standard is interesting to me. And today I had an interesting conversation with a person at the IBWC in El Paso in contemplation of this, and her name shall remain off the table, although you might know who she is. And what she told me actually surprised me about how we manage for that. You know, when I see 115 plus or minus 30, I tend to think, well, you know, it could be low and it could be high. And what she told me is that in the U.S. ice, that's 145 parts per million. There's no plus or minus. It's 115 plus 30 that they're aiming for. And they actively aim for this, right? There are drains in that Yuma area that carry very saline water, and they're trying to get those mixed to the maximum possible amount in that reach so that they have to release less water out of the main stem reservoir. So there's something going on there that I don't fully understand, Alfonso, and it concerns me a little bit, although I fully appreciate the idea of the U.S. trying to maximize its water use. But it seems to me maybe that, well, what this person told me was that with better equipment and speedier knowledge, we could do a better job of managing this. So I don't think this is impossible to manage for. I just think we need to perhaps throw some more resources at it. You know, just one oddball comment. This whole idea of salt balance, it drives me nuts as an engineer. I mean, I just don't think it's feasible as an engineer. It's like mumbo jumbo trying to confuse people. You cannot, in a system that has native salts in it, reach salt balance. I mean, this just doesn't work. It's a violation of the law of conservation of mass. If you're evaporating water and you bring salt in and you're sending it out, I just don't see how that works. So it never did happen, and to my engineering sense, that's a very good thing. I think I'm going to end there, because I have a whole nother speaking role, and if I keep speaking, I'll stomp on the rest of my material. But this is a fun group. I know we're a tiny little group here, but this was really an important minute and a defining moment, I think, in the relationship between these two countries. And it's a pleasure, Stephen, to be here, and with all of you, Evan, too.
So I guess guess we have about 30 minutes now for questions and discussion. I think they would like us to use the microphone, so if, I don't know if somebody could.
I'm Neil Gregg. I'm the discussion in the second part, so I won't get into what I might say either. Thanks for that tip, Brad. I was wondering, you know, reading up on this ahead of time, even prior to 1961, what was the motivation for the United States to begin to be sympathetic at all to wanting to cooperate? I read in one of the papers that we were afraid that Mexico would take us to the International Court of Justice. And I wondered if going to the International Court of Justice is something you have to agree that you will be sued there, or how does that work? What is the mechanism for that legal part?
So it's an interesting, it's an interesting issue. The U.S. Could resist being taken to the International Court of Justice under normal circumstances. The Connolly Amendment sets conditions on that, and one of the aspects of it is that the Senate needs to agree that the U.S. would be taken to, that this would be an adjudication that the U.S. would support. But the 1944 Water Treaty precedes that. And in Article 24, it commits the United States to a process of adjudication. The first stop there would probably be the International Court of Arbitration, the Inter-American Court of Arbitration. Unless the U.S. and Mexico would agree to take it somewhere else. So the 1944 Water Treaty actually presented, it kind of bollocksed up the U.S. thinking. The reason the U.S. was so worried throughout this entire period about adjudication is that I think right from the beginning, and Brad's right from the beginning, there was this sense that that was a problem. And then it becomes more of a problem because this is also really, the 60s is just a fascinating time in every possible respect. Because you see the real rapid evolution of international law during this period. So in 1966, you get the Helsinki rules adopted by the International Law Association. In 1967, the UN holds a conference on water for peace in Washington, D.C., in which the foreign ministers meet to talk about the salinity issue, right? And it's not that this whole issue of equity is discussed in every presentation at the Water for Peace conference, quite the contrary, but it is part of the discourse. It is what diplomats are talking about. And then, of course, in 1972, you get the Stockholm meeting on the human environment. So a lot of things are just sort of going into hyperdrive in terms of the international thinking about the environment, about equity, about how you manage water. And that, I think that is in good measure what accentuates the U.S. view, at least at the State Department, that this isn't winnable. And so if you're going to avoid, and that must be Kissinger's thinking, if you're going to avoid going to arbitration, because Rabassa actually put it to him, and it's in the Foreign Relations of the United States record. He puts it to him. Well, let's go to arbitration. Okay, let's just do it. Let's go to arbitration. Here are the rules. What do you think? Because you have to agree to both sides agree to the rules. And Kissinger says, well, those are pretty fair rules. Okay, but let's talk. and it's just and it's at that point that I think that the perception is that if it goes to international law, the U.S. will lose the case, And then the prescriptions could be worse than something that would be negotiated. So then the U.S. Convenes the Brownell Commission, and you get what you get in minute 242, which I do think is a win-win for both countries, because it kind of sets in motion this effort of basin-wide thinking about salinity, and it sets a lower basin standard, which you can debate whether that's the right standard or not for sure, but I think by setting a standard, it kind of forced everybody to the table to think about what could be done and how you could manage it. Yeah. And so that's a long answer to your question. Yeah.
Really quickly. Yeah. Well, and this goes back even further. Norris Hundley's written extensively on the history of the U.S.-Mexican Water Treaty. He wrote a book, one of his more recent ones, and it's about 10 years. It's called The Great Thirst. It's about California. It's kind of like the summation of his knowledge on this topic. But in the early 20th century, international water law suggested if you control the headwaters, you have no obligation to the people down the stream. And so in 1928, Herbert Hoover presides over what's known as the Santa Fe Conference, and the basin states discuss sharing of the water, and they don't even invite Mexico. And to make this even more surreal, 5 years earlier, the senator from Arizona, Henry Ashurst, has actually proposed that the U.S. buy Baja California. This is in the 20th century. This isn't in the 19th century. This is in the 20th century. So there's a lot that happens between 28 and then the 60s. And 44 is really important because Mexicans are serving in the military. They're harvesting crops. And President Roosevelt's on his deathbed trying to shore up further support. And that's where this treaty comes in. And so it's really, again, it's very interesting. It's the leveraging of the relationship for U.S. foreign policy writ large.
First of all, thank you all. It's been really fun and fascinating listening to those presentations. My question kind of picks at the previous question a little further. I don't know why I have this impression, I'm sure I read it someplace, that the Salinity Minute was influenced in part by concerns around U.S. oil supply and interest in Mexico's national oil production. And I'm asking, you both have sort of answered a little differently. Steve, you said it's sort of on the merits of the issue of the water dispute and the international courts and their possibilities of answers. And you answered that there's this broader geopolitical relationship. And I think in a contemporary context, it's very meaningful to me to understand how much those bigger geopolitics are going to impact our ability to work on water as a transboundary issue with Mexico when we don't know really what's up with the bigger geopolitical story right now. So I'm curious, first of all about oil, and secondly, that balance between the bigger set of issues and the water as the determinant on its own.
Okay, so if I can answer, Evan, you might have some insight on this too, so I'll be quick. First, in the actual diplomatic correspondence, oil doesn't appear. However, from time to time, the State Department was writing country reports. That is, these were typically lengthy, single-space, 14-page legal-size documents that went on for 10, 12, 15, 20 pages. So it was a serious effort to kind of draw together the intelligence that the U.S. Had on Mexico. Now, when you read those, then you see a broad range of considerations, things that are just in the sort of in the background, that are part of the U.S. sort of overarching strategic view on Mexico. Typically, trade and immigration were right up front. Those were the two biggies at the time. But then they start talking about other things, and they start. The other thing I should say is security was really important. This was right after the Cuban Revolution. They were very concerned about the agitation in Mexicali, and in fact, the FBI had mounted a secretive program to try and infiltrate. This is one of the FBI's first big international forays. Okay. The agitation in the Mexicali Valley, and there's an independent set of reports that are available there that recently become available with some of the new releases about the COINTEL program, of which this was a part. And so the U.S. was really worried about the agitation, what it meant for Mexican politics, and they were really concerned about Mexican political stability. That was a key thing. Kennedy was very concerned about Mexico, and so the Alliance for Progress, which he was promoting, saw Mexico as a keystone player for the Americans. The United States wanted, and this is, I think, consistent throughout, wanted Mexico to be a strong ally of the United States and to be a kind of a pitch point for the Americas in trying to promote the U.S. view of how things should go in the Americas. So their geopolitical concerns did matter. That's what I'm saying. They don't show up in specifics. Towards the end of it, interestingly enough, they're talking about nuclear power. Not oil, but nuclear power on the Gulf of California, down by San Felipe, et cetera, and the possibility for having a nuclear power plant that would also support desalination. There were some really ambitious projects that were laid on the table, but kind of dismissed. What I will say is I think this is a real, and I say this in the paper, is a real triumph for the foreign ministry in Mexico and the Department of State. This is one of the few occasions where you see politics at that level really guiding the final outcomes in terms of U.S.-Mexican water management. Usually it's more decentralized than that, as you know. But it took a long time.
But Stephen, closer to home, we haven't mentioned the Rio Grande at all in this conversation. Were there interests regarding the Rio Grande that played into this desire to settle this minute and this crisis?
The short answer is no. The interesting thing is that, and this gets to the politics of the basin states and the two parts of the rivers, and that is that the 1940 Water Treaty was very deliberately configured in three parts, and the Californians didn't agree with the Texans didn't agree with the Californians. Arizona was sort of waffling along the edges of the California position, but didn't really agree with it. It was concerned about the whole water rights problem on the Colorado River in the lower Colorado. And the Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s. So basically, you see the let's see, I'm losing track of my question.
Rio Grande.
Yeah, the Rio Grande. Yeah. On the Rio, it's just being dealt with separately through this period of time, and there's no real effort to link it among the basin, the Colorado Basin states, and to me it just kind of reflected this historic tension between the two rivers. There wasn't wasn't an effort to. There were issues. There were salinity issues during the 1960s on the Rio Grande. The only time in the whole record that this comes up is that the Mexicans say that well, you dealt with us so even-handedly on the Rio Grande. Why aren't you dealing with us even-handedly on the Colorado? But the whole salinity issue on the Rio Grande was dealt with rather smoothly with the IBWC, and it's just treated separately. I didn't see anything in the record that suggested that the Committee of 14 ever wanted to draw the Rio Grande into the Colorado River discussion.
Thank you very much. This has been really, really interesting. I agree with Jennifer. Alfonso, how did the folks in the Mexicali Valley, what did they think of Minute 319, and what are they thinking about the negotiation of the next Minute 32X, we call it?
Well, and even in the 319, there is a point, point number 5, about salinity. And this was the first doubt that people manifest about. What the salinity issue remains the same. It was the same, the main doubt about the 319. But as you know, you were in the negotiation, this is a minute, very dense minute, you know, talking about scarcity, surpluses, environmental projects, financing. So my perception is that the people, so not just the agriculturists, find some good points and another not. For example, the point referred to the new rules to establish the critical lines, you know, for delivery water, to determine drought, no, or scarcity condition, and surplus condition. This is one. The other one is the environmental issue. The environmental issue is very acceptable for people, mostly for the people in San Luis Rio Colorado, because they live nearby the water course. But there is a point that people are very reluctant about this. Is referred to the financing, the projects that finance infrastructure in Mexico for irrigation areas. And they felt that this is a responsibility for the Mexican government. And they say, and I have heard frequently, they say, this is a responsibility for CONAGUA, for the Mexican federal government. And we should not receive some funding for this kind of projects that have to be with irrigation in Mexico. This part is not really accepted. And the other one has to be with the forms, with the mechanisms that the negotiators used. For example, you know that the 20th of November is a very important date in Mexico. 20th of November is the revolution date in Mexico. And this was a point that hurts the souls and the Mexican people. It's like, why the U.S. and Mexico went to Coronado and signed a minute in the Revolution Day. And we don't know nothing about this. We don't know nothing. And already signing about the surplus, scarcity, environment, financing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And salinity, don't touch it. So there are many people that complained about the way how this process was. Not about the points exactly, but the way, the mechanisms. So in talking about the salinity issue, people agree to that it should be mentioned in some kind of modification for better. And they say this remains the same. And as you know, as you saw, the graphics are the same. And they say we think that the governments should have been working on this issue, the salinity, for the future, for the 3-2x minus should be focused on salinity. So some parts of the 319 is okay, another not. Really.
Thank you so much, all of you. It's been a very interesting discussion. Some burning questions have been answered from my research. And actually, I have one more burning question, Alfonso, for you about the farmers during the salinity crisis and their organization. You mentioned that they, financially took responsibility, an initiative for defending their area against the salt, so to speak. But I was curious also politically how they were able to organize, if they were also, if it looked like there were different areas that organized, and if they were able to come together at any point, if that unification, continued through the years, even past the salinity crisis. So I have, a lot of questions about the farmers and their
Yes.
organization.
Actually, they come together very early in the stage that Steve mentioned. At the very first stage, they come together, and they start collecting funding for particular individual farmers. After that, afterwards came support from the federal government and the rehabilitation programs, all these formal programs. But at the beginning was the union and unification of the people, the local people, with the commercial sector in Mexicali, with agriculturists in San Luis Rio Colorado, and they thought that there was important to come together first in order to make some kind of pressure to the president and to Rabasa. Actually, in Mexicali, there were at that time, during the 17th and 16th, at least 3 or 4 senators from the Mexicali Valley. So the farmer sector was very strong politically, and they had a huge capacity for lobbying in Mexico City. They were senators, deputies, and all of them come from the farmer sectors. So this sector was very strong economically and politically at that time.
Because of the number of people? Or?
Yeah, 40,600 people, or water rights. That still remains.
But did they have a charismatic leader, or it was more of an organic? You think?
Several leaders. Yeah. Actually, several. There were leaders from CCI. Alfonso Garzón was one of them. From CNC, Confederación Nacional Campesina, from Federación de Pequeños Propietarios, from 5 of this come together with a lot of power, economic power and political power. And all of them come together and work together, which is the informal way to work, and to make pressure directly with Rabasa. They say, we need the president here in Mexicali, and Rabasa here, and both of them here. They were very strong people, and they had power to do that.
And how about now? Are they still unified?
They remain unified during the 16th and 17th, and maybe a little bit later. But they had to return to the normal activity of separate activities as unions. No? But they still are working in Mexicali. The SSI, CNC, and all of this, it still remains in Mexicali today.
Evan, you mentioned this student massacre. I don't know that story. Was it connected to the activism or totally separate?
No,
But it was a
not
catalyst
connected,
of some.
but it's permeating society and the corruption of the PRI. I think it does impact Echeverria. He is an ultimate point of power, but also of vulnerability because they've cut off press coverage of this. 300 or 400 people have died, and so he's really pushing for radical programs that stand up to the United States and also try and rally populist support. So there's not a direct connection, but you've got to understand the overall picture of what's happening in Mexico in the 60s. But this regional organizer, Alfonso Garzón, they organize. You got to understand this too. There's no road between Baja California and the rest of the country until 1959. And they organize a caravan from Mexicali to Mexico City. It's the Salt Caravan. And it kind of falls apart towards the end of it, but they actually get there. And this guy, Alfonso Garzón, he has to be bought off. They give him a position in the legislature. But he's raising Cain in Mexicali and in the and organizing these union of unions.
Let me comment there really quick. It is important what the point that Evan raises, because Luis Echeverria was the Minister of the Interior under Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, and so in that position during the 60s, he had his finger on what was going on politically, for political control in the Mexicali Valley, etc. Díaz Ordaz is implementing Minute 218, so things are kind of calm, but he has another agenda with the United States, and that's a boundary treaty to complete the boundary arrangement. Díaz Ordaz focused on the boundary treaty, and that was signed in November 1970, just a couple of weeks before he's out of the presidency. So that was a legacy piece for Gustavo Díaz Ordaz. And so there's a case to be made. It looks like it's certainly circumstantial. I don't have the historical record to prove it, but it looks like he made a very deliberate decision to kind of turn the salinity business over to Luis Echeverria, knowing that it would actually help Echeverria politically, and which it did. It's just an interesting alignment, a historical alignment of circumstances.
We got one more question, then we'll take a break.
I'm Pete Taylor from Sociology. Thanks very much for a really interesting, compelling set of presentations. Especially in the context of what's happened more recently with cross-border transnational collaboration around Minute 319. I'm wondering if y'all could talk a little bit about to what extent there might have been analogous cooperation or interest across the border below the level of the basin states. You know, Brad had mentioned that we weren't really thinking about the environment in 1963, but I wonder if there might have been some kind of interest here in the United States, maybe from environmental or union interests that might have been also pushing the U.S. to be more flexible.
Well, the short answer is not much, but the environmental thing was going on. In 1969, we get NEPA, and there's that interesting effort in the State Department viewed the environmentalists as annoying, as folks who just didn't understand this complex issue. They just couldn't grasp it, and it wasn't legitimate in terms of the law of the river. It just wasn't legitimate, even though, of course, the Federal Water Pollution Act, and then once the EPA took stewardship of that, that was had moved, I think, fairly definitively by 1969 to treating salinity as a form of pollution, as a contaminant. So environmentalists picked up on this, and then the National Wildlife Federation had a big meeting in 1972 in Mexico City, and it's a really interesting piece of diplomatic correspondence because the U.S. Embassy is trying to manage that such that the representatives from the environmental groups do not talk about salinity. They didn't want the environmentalists to talk about salinity. They could talk about anything else. And it really is kind of a fascinating little historical moment and looking at how you're in this transition phase of public acceptance and legitimacy of environmental values in public policy. And I think that was something that was problematical in the salinity negotiation from the view of the Committee of 14, from the view of the State Department and the IBWC. So they were all trying to get their hands around this environmental thing, not knowing that, and just didn't know where that was going to go. It just seemed so complex and uncertain, and it bollocksed up the legal positions of the United States. It seemed to tilt towards Mexico. And that's fairly good. And I think it did. It did tilt towards Mexico.
So we have one more question. They're setting up our coffee break now. So
Okay.
one question and then we'll have our coffee.
Okay, actually, a short comment, I guess, like following up to what Brad said. I think I can confirm that people are really aiming for these 145 ppm salinity differential between imperial and the border. But the absolute salinity value, my understanding is that it's actually dropped gradually by about 90 ppm over the last, say, 10 years. So this, yeah, that's what they say. I don't know. Sure, I'm not collecting that data. But what that means, obviously, is that sort of the Yuma Area Office of Reclamation is having a harder time meeting the differential because they're giving less leverage. And I've heard them say that this is in part because of sort of cleanup efforts upstream of Imperial Dam. So even within the US, we have sort of different efforts. There's millions of dollars going into reducing salinity in the upper Colorado and upstream of the Imperial Dam in the lower basin. And at the same time, we have to have this huge effort to meet the salinity differential and giving those people down there less and less leverage to do so. So it's kind of interesting even within the US what kind of conflicting efforts are going on to some extent, yeah. My question, I guess, was sort of very broad and naive. Given the history of what affected the progress of some of these agreements, would you expect that the current administration, that this has a significant impact on negotiations of the 32X or whatever is going on?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, let's save that for the second panel because I think there are some really good expertise in the room here to talk about that issue.
Alfonso wants
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
How to will be progressing this relationship, how we can see this possible relationships about the water issues?
Yeah, I guess just, I mean, it seemed like, yeah, the negotiation initially, from the US side, but also from the Mexican side.
Under this new administration.
Right, yeah. And each of those presidents had some say in it.
We could see that the negotiations during the last years, recent years, 8 years, were very productive. Even in the general way, even the 319 is mostly accepted, that not accepted. It's 5 points accepted, 2 no. But in the future, there are some sense that will be difficulties to go for war. Even the people say, even the functionaries, people in the government say that it will be a difficult time to work in this kind of issues, particularly in the quality issues, because it seems that the whole basin make arrangement in the upper basin, deliver volumes and to dilute salts, etc. And this will be a huge effort to induce. So they see this point as a very hard to achieve in the near future.
Well, Thanks, everybody, for this first.